Imagine this. It's 1210 in southern France, and you're a simple farmer accused of heresy. Guards drag you into a dimly lit dungeon, where a sinister, pyramid-shaped device awaits, promising unimaginable agony. This is the Judas Cradle, a tool of terror in one of history's bloodiest religious wars. Chapter 1. The roots of heresy in Languedoc. Let's dive right into the heart of it. All the Albigensian Crusade didn't just erupt out of nowhere. It was fueled by deep-seated religious tensions in the region known as Languedoc, in what we now call southern France. Back in the early 13th century, this area was a hotbed of cultural and spiritual diversity. Far from the strict Catholic orthodoxy enforced by the Church in Rome, the Cathars, also called Albigensians after the town of Albi, were the main targets. They believed in a dualistic worldview, a good spiritual realm created by God, and an evil material world made by Satan. This meant they rejected many Catholic sacraments, like baptism with water, and even saw the cross as a symbol of evil because it represented Christ's suffering in the physical world. To understand why this sparked such fury, picture the Catholic Church as a massive empire clinging to power. The Cathars' ideas were spreading like wildfire among nobles and peasants alike, challenging the Church's authority and its lucrative tithing system. For example, Cathar perfecti, their spiritual leaders lived ascetic lives, abstaining from meat, sex, and material wealth, which made them incredibly appealing to people tired of corrupt clergy. One famous Cathar stronghold was the city of Béziers, where thousands sought refuge from persecution. The Pope at the time, Innocent III, saw this as a direct threat to Christianity itself. He excommunicated local lords who tolerated the heretics and called for a holy war to stamp them out. This set the stage for brutal invasions by northern French knights, eager for land and glory under the guise of piety. Practical tip for wrapping your head around this: think of it like a medieval culture clash, where tolerance in the south clashed with rigid control from the north, much like modern ideological battles. By 1209, the crusade was officially launched, blending religious zeal with political ambition. We'll see how this escalated into outright massacre in the next chapter. But for now, remember, the roots in Languedoc weren't just about faith. They were about power, land, and reshaping society. Chapter 2. The Siege of Béziers and the First Bloodshed. The year is 1209, and the Albigensian Crusade is no longer just a threat, it's a brutal reality tearing through southern France. The first major target was Béziers, a thriving city that had become a haven for Cathars and their sympathizers. Picture a bustling medieval town, its high stone walls packed with thousands of people, not just heretics but Catholics, Jews, and others who just wanted to live their lives. The Crusaders, led by northern French nobles and backed by the Pope's blessing, weren't here to negotiate. They wanted to send a message: defy the Church, and you'll pay the ultimate price. The siege began in July, with the Crusader army tens of thousands strong encircling Béziers. The city's defenders were outnumbered, and panic spread as catapults hurled stones and arrows rained down. On July 22nd, after a brief resistance, a group of townsfolk tried to negotiate, but things spiraled out of control when a skirmish broke out. The Crusaders breached the walls, and what followed was one of the most horrific massacres of the Middle Ages. Chroniclers report that soldiers were told to kill everyone, regardless of faith, with the infamous phrase attributed to the papal legate Arnaud Amalric: kill them all. God will know his own. While historians debate whether he actually said this, the result was undeniable. Nearly 20,000 people, men, women, and children, were slaughtered. Churches where people sought refuge became death traps, and the city was burned to the ground. This wasn't just about religion, it was a power play. The Crusaders looted Béziers, seizing wealth and land, while the massacre terrified other towns into submission. A practical tip for understanding the scale: imagine a modern city of similar size being wiped out in a single day. It's a chilling reminder of how fear was weaponized. The brutality at Béziers set a grim precedent, showing the Crusaders would stop at nothing to crush dissent. The fall of Béziers was just the beginning. It sent shockwaves through Languedoc, forcing other cities to choose between surrender or resistance. Next, we'll explore how the Crusades' leader, Simon de Montfort, turned this momentum into a campaign of terror. Chapter 3: Simon de Montfort and the Rise of Terror. The Albigensian Crusade needed a ruthless leader to keep its momentum after the bloodbath at Béziers, and Simon de Montfort stepped up to become its most feared figure. This northern French noble wasn't just a devout Catholic, he was a skilled warrior with a hunger for power and land. By late 1209, he was appointed the Crusades' military commander, tasked with rooting out heresy across Languedoc. His approach was simple: crush resistance with overwhelming force and make examples of anyone who dared defy the Church. Montfort's campaign was a masterclass in medieval warfare and intimidation. He targeted fortified towns like Carcassonne and Minerve, using sieges, starvation, and brute force to break their defenses. In Minerve, for example, after a grueling siege in 1210, he offered leniency to Catholics but burned 140 Cathar perfecti alive when they refused to renounce their faith. This wasn't just punishment, it was a spectacle meant to terrify others into submission. Montfort's men also began using brutal tactics to extract confessions or force conversions, setting the stage for tools like the Judas Cradle, which we'll dive into later. His reputation grew so fearsome that entire villages surrendered at the mere rumor of his approach. What drove Montfort? Faith played a part, but so did ambition. The Church promised Crusaders absolution for their sins and the right to seize heretics' lands. For a minor noble like Montfort, this was a golden opportunity to amass wealth and titles. A practical tip for grasping his impact: think of him as a medieval warlord, blending religious zeal with cold pragmatism, much like a modern-day strategist, playing a high-stakes game of conquest. Montfort's reign of terror reshaped Languedoc, but it also sparked fierce resistance from local lords and Cathar strongholds. Next, we'll uncover how the people of the south fought back against this relentless onslaught. Chapter 4: Resistance and Resilience in Languedoc's Simon de Montfort's Crusaders carved a bloody path through southern France. The people of Languedoc didn't just roll over and accept defeat. The Cathars and their supporters, nobles, knights, and common folk alike, mounted a fierce resistance that turned the Albigensian Crusade into a grueling, decades-long struggle. The south was a land of rugged castles, perched on cliffs and hills, and these strongholds became the backbone of defiance against the northern invaders. Places like Toulouse, Foix, and Montségur weren't just fortresses. They were symbols of a culture fighting to survive against an enemy that saw their way of life as an affront to God. Let's set the scene. It's 1211, and the city of Toulouse, a cultural and political hub of Languedoc, is under siege. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, a complex figure who wavered between appeasing the church and protecting his people, rallied his forces to defend the city. Unlike the Crusaders, who were unified by religious fervor, and promises of plunder. The defenders were a diverse mix: Cathar believers, Catholic sympathizers, and local knights bound by loyalty to their land. They used guerrilla tactics, ambushing supply lines and harassing Montfort's troops in the narrow, winding valleys of the region. For example, at the Battle of Castelnaudary in 1211, local forces nearly trapped Montfort's army, showing that the south could hit back hard. The Cathars themselves played a key role in this resistance. Their perfecti, the spiritual elite, didn't just preach, they inspired. These men and women, known for their asceticism and courage, often moved secretly between safe houses, ministering to believers and keeping the faith alive despite the constant threat of capture. One vivid story tells of a Cathar woman named Esclarmonde de Foix, a noble who became a perfecter and helped fund and organize resistance efforts. Her castle at Foix became a rallying point, a place where fighters and refugees could regroup. This wasn't just about military battles. It was about preserving a way of life that valued tolerance and spiritual purity over the church's rigid hierarchy. But resistance came at a cost. Montfort's forces responded with escalating brutality, targeting not just fighters, but entire communities. Towns that resisted faced sieges that could last months, with starvation and disease claiming as many lives as swords. A practical tip for understanding this dynamic: picture a modern resistance movement, like a community standing up to an oppressive regime, using whatever tools they have: local knowledge, small-scale attacks, and sheer determination to hold their ground. The people of Languedoc were doing the same, but with catapults and crossbows instead of modern tech. Despite their courage, the defenders faced overwhelming odds. Montfort's army was bolstered by fresh crusaders from the north, drawn by papal indulgences and the promise of land. The resistance slowed the crusade, but couldn't stop it entirely, and cracks began to show in the South's unity as some lords, under pressure, swore allegiance to the church. This struggle set the stage for the introduction of terrifying new methods to break the Cathar spirit, including the Judas Cradle, which we'll explore next as the crusade took an even darker turn. Chapter 5: The Judas Cradle and the Tools of Terrors. The Albigensian Crusade dragged on. The Crusaders didn't just rely on swords and sieges to crush the Cathar resistance. They turned to psychological and physical torture to break their enemies' will. Enter the Judas Cradle, one of the most horrific devices of the medieval era, designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation on those accused of heresy. Picture a tall, pyramid-shaped wooden seat, sharp at the tip, suspended above the ground. Victims were stripped, bound, and slowly lowered onto the point, which was strategically designed to cause excruciating agony without immediately killing them. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was to terrify entire communities into submission. The Judas Cradle wasn't used in isolation. It was part of a broader toolkit of torture employed by the Crusaders and their church allies. Interrogators, often monks or papal agents, would use the device in dank castle dungeons or makeshift prisons to extract confessions from suspected Cathars. A victim might be hoisted by ropes, their weight pressing them onto the pyramid's tip, with interrogators adjusting the pressure to prolong suffering. Historical accounts, though sparse, suggest the device was particularly favored for its ability to humiliate, as victims were often tortured in front of others to serve as a warning. For instance, in fortified towns like Lavore, captured in 1211, such methods were used to break the spirit of defiant locals after the town's fall. Why was this so effective? The Cathar's dualist beliefs made them particularly vulnerable to psychological torment. They saw the body as a corrupt vessel, so tortures that defiled it, like the Judas Cradle, were seen as especially degrading. Plus, the public nature of these punishments amplified fear, discouraging others from harboring heretics. A practical tip for grasping the impact: think of how modern propaganda uses fear to control populations, but replace media with raw, visceral displays of suffering. The Crusaders knew that a single tortured victim could silence a whole village. Torture wasn't random, it was systematic. The Church set up early versions of inquisitorial tribunals to identify heretics, and devices like the Judas Cradle became tools to enforce orthodoxy. But this brutality also fueled resentment, pushing some in Languedoc to fight harder. Next, we'll dive into how these torturous tactics evolved into the formal Inquisition, tightening the noose around the Cathars. Chapter 6: The Birth of the Inquisition and the Hunt for Heretics. The Albigensian Crusade raged through Languedoc. The Catholic Church realized that brute force, alonsages, massacres, and tortures like the Judas Cradle couldn't fully eradicate the Cathar heresy. The heretics were slippery, blending into communities, hiding in plain sight, and even winning sympathy from Catholics who disliked the Crusaders' heavy-handed tactics. By 1215, the Church shifted gears, laying the groundwork for a new, more systematic approach: the Inquisition. This wasn't just a military campaign anymore. It was a calculated, legalistic hunt to root out every last trace of dissent, and it would change the way the Church dealt with heresy for centuries. Let's set the stage. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, convened by Pope Innocent III, was a turning point. This massive gathering of bishops, abbots, and secular leaders didn't just address the crusade, formalized the Church's strategy to combat heresy. The council declared that secular rulers had a duty to identify and punish heretics, or face excommunication themselves. This was a game-changer. It turned every lord, mayor, and village head into a potential informant, creating a climate of paranoia across Languedoc. The Church also began appointing inquisitors-trained clerics, often Dominican monks, who were tasked with investigating, interrogating, and judging suspected heretics. These weren't your average priests. They were educated, relentless, and armed with papal authority to pry into every corner of society. The inquisitors' methods were chillingly thorough. They didn't just rely on accusations. They actively sought out heretics through a network of spies and informants. Picture a small village in 1216, say near Cosin, where a Dominican inquisitor arrives with a retinue of scribes and guards. He'd summon the entire community to a church, demand oaths of loyalty to the Catholic faith, and encourage people to denounce their neighbors, friends, or even family members. Refusal to cooperate could mark you as a suspect. Those accused were brought before tribunals, where they faced intense questioning. The inquisitors used a mix of psychological pressure and physical coercion, sometimes involving devices like the Judas Cradle to extract confessions. A real example comes from the town of Montauban, where records show inquisitors interrogating dozens of locals, many of whom were tortured or threatened with exile until they named names. What made the Inquisition so effective was its blend of fear and bureaucracy. Unlike the chaotic violence of the Crusade's early years, this was organized terror. Inquisitors kept detailed records, cataloging confessions, punishments, and property seizures. For instance, a Cathar believer might lose their home and land, which would then be redistributed to loyal Catholics or Crusader allies. This wasn't just about saving souls. It was about dismantling the economic and social support systems that allowed Catharism to thrive. A practical tip for understanding this: think of the Inquisition like a medieval version of a surveillance state, where fear of being watched turned communities against themselves, much like how mistrust can fracture societies today. The punishments were brutal but varied. Minor offenders might face public penance, like wearing a yellow cross sewn onto their clothes to mark them as former heretics, humiliating badge that could last a lifetime. More serious cases, like unrepentant Cathars or those who sheltered them, faced imprisonment in grim dungeons or death by burning at the stake. In 1219, for example, in the town of Marmande, after a Crusader victory, hundreds of suspected heretics were executed, many burned alive in a public spectacle meant to deter others. These punishments weren't random, they were carefully staged to maximize fear and compliance. But the Inquisition wasn't foolproof. Many Cathars went underground, practicing their faith in secret. Some fled to remote castles like Montségur, which became a legendary stronghold. Others relied on a network of sympathizers who hid them in attics or cellars, much like resistance fighters in later eras. This cat-and-mouse game frustrated the inquisitors, who doubled down on their efforts, refining their methods and expanding their reach. The pressure was relentless, but it also hardened the resolve of those who refused to bend. The rise of the Inquisition marked a new phase in the Crusade, one where the battlefield shifted from city walls to the minds and souls of Languedoc's people. It was a war of attrition designed to outlast the heretics. Next, we'll explore how the Cathars and their supporters made their last stands in fortified strongholds, clinging to hope against overwhelming odds. Chapter 7: The Last Strongholds and the Siege of Montségur. The early Arling S. The Albigensian Crusade had transformed Languedoc into a scarred battleground, with entire towns reduced to rubble and thousands dead or displaced. Yet the Cathars and their supporters clung to hope, retreating to a network of fortified castles perched high in the Pyrenees and other rugged corners of southern France. These strongholds places, like Montségur, Queribus, and Peripetus, became symbols of defiance, where the remaining Cathar leaders, their perfecti, and loyal fighters held out against the relentless Crusader onslaught. This chapter dives into the desperate stand at these fortresses, with a focus on the dramatic siege of Montségur in 1066 a pivotal moment that nearly marked the end of Cathar resistance. Imagine Montségur in 1243, a castle perched atop a steep, rocky peak, its limestone walls gleaming under the sun, surrounded by treacherous cliffs that made it seem impregnable. This wasn't just a fortress, it was a spiritual sanctuary for the Cathars, often called their last cathedral. Hundreds of Cathar perfecti, along with their families, supporters, and a small garrison of knights, had taken refuge there, turning it into a hub of resistance. The castle's remote location made it a natural choice for the Cathars to regroup, hide their sacred texts, and continue their religious practices away from the prying eyes of the Inquisition. For years, Montségur had been a thorn in the Crusaders' side, a place where the heretics could defy the Church's reach and inspire others to resist. The siege of Montségur began in May 1243, led by Judas Cradle, a French royal commander, acting under orders from the Church and King Louis IX. The Crusader army, numbering around 6,000 men, faced a daunting challenge. The castle's position was so high and defensible that direct assault was nearly impossible. The defenders, numbering only a few hundred, including about 200 Cathar perfecti and a small force of fighters, were led by Pierre Roger de Mirepoix, a fierce local lord who knew the terrain like the back of his hand. The Cathars relied on their knowledge of the rugged landscape, using narrow mountain paths to smuggle in supplies and reinforcements, while the Crusaders struggled to maintain their siege in the harsh, rocky terrain. The siege dragged on for nearly 10 months, a grueling test of endurance for both sides. The Crusaders bombarded the castle with catapults, hurling stones day and night to weaken the walls and morale. Meanwhile, the defenders fought back with crossbows and whatever weapons they could muster, occasionally launching daring raids to disrupt the enemy's camp. Food and water grew scarce inside Montségur, and the winter of 1243 was brutal, with cold winds battering the exposed fortress. Yet, the Cathars' faith kept them resolute. The perfecti held secret ceremonies, comforting their followers with their dualist beliefs, which taught that enduring suffering in this corrupt world would lead to salvation in the spiritual realm. Stories from survivors, passed down through chronicles, tell of perfecti like Bishop Gilherbert de Costers, who led prayers and consoled the starving defenders, urging them to hold fast. The Crusaders, however, had time and resources on their side. In early 1244, they pulled off a daring move. A small group of soldiers, guided by local traitors who knew the mountain paths, scaled a near-vertical cliff under cover of darkness to capture a small outlying tower. This breach allowed them to bring up a massive trebuchet, a siege engine capable of launching huge boulders with devastating force. The bombardment intensified, smashing parts of the outer walls and making life inside unbearable. By March 1244, with supplies nearly gone and the castle crumbling, Pierre Roger negotiated a surrender. The terms were harsh but strategic. The defenders could leave if they renounced their faith, but unrepentant Cathars would face death. On March 16, 1244, Montségur fell. Over 200 Cathar perfecti and believers refused to recant and were led down the mountain to a massive pyre at the foot of the hill, now called the Prat dels Cremats, or Field of the Burned. They were burned alive in a spectacle meant to crush the spirit of resistance across Languedoc. A few defenders, including a small group who escaped with rumored Cathar treasures, possibly sacred texts or relics, slipped away in the night before the surrender, keeping the faith alive in secret. A practical tip for grasping the stakes. Think of Montségur as a medieval Alamo, a last stand where every defender knew the odds but fought for their beliefs. Much like modern struggles for cultural or ideological survival, the fall of Montségur was a devastating blow to the Cathars, but it wasn't the end. Scattered groups continued to resist in other strongholds, and the Inquisition tightened its grip to hunt them down. Next, we'll explore how these final pockets of resistance tried to keep the Cathar faith alive against an increasingly relentless enemy. Chapter 8. The final flickers of Cathar resistance. The fall of Montségur in 1244 was a crushing blow to the Cathars, but it didn't snuff out their resistance entirely. Scattered across Languedoc's remote valleys, hidden caves, and remaining fortresses like Quarabus and Peripetous, small groups of Cathar believers, their perfecti, and loyal supporters clung to their faith, determined to keep it alive against the relentless pursuit of the Inquisition and royal forces. This chapter dives into the desperate, shadowy struggle of these final holdouts, who operated like an underground resistance movement, evading capture, preserving their beliefs, and striking back when they could. It's a story of resilience, secrecy, and the cost of defiance in a world closing in around them. Picture Languedoc in the late 1240s. The region is a patchwork of devastation and uneasy control. Crusader armies and French royal troops, now under the growing influence of King Louis IX, patrol the countryside, while inquisitors comb villages for any trace of heresy. The Cathars, once a vibrant community with thousands of followers, are now fugitives. Their perfecter men and women who had taken vows of poverty and purity move in secret, disguised as merchants or peasants, slipping through forests and mountain passes to minister to hidden believers. These survivors relied on a clandestine network of sympathizers, often called fatits, landless knights and nobles who had lost everything to the Crusaders, but refused to submit. These networks were the Cathar's lifeline, providing food, shelter, and information to keep the faith alive. One key figure in this underground resistance was Pierre Ortier, a Cathar leader who emerged in the late 1240s. Unlike earlier who preached openly, Ortier operated like a modern covert operative. He and his brother Guidham travelled between safe houses, often at night, to perform the consacramentum, a sacred Cathar ritual that cleansed believers of sin and prepared them for salvation. Historical records from inquisitorial archives describe how Ortier's group used coded messages and secret meeting spots, like isolated farms or caves in the Ariege region, to evade capture. For example, a surviving account tells of a Cathar believer in the village of Aix-les-Thermes who hid Ortier in a cellar for weeks, sneaking him bread and water while inquisitors searched nearby. This kind of loyalty was common but incredibly risky. Anyone caught aiding a heretic faced imprisonment, torture, or death. The remaining Cathar strongholds, like Queribus and Peripetus, played a critical role in this phase. These castles, perched on jagged peaks in the Corbières mountains, were smaller than Montségur, but just as defensible. Queribus, for instance, was a maze of stone walls and narrow passages, accessible only by treacherous paths that a small garrison could hold against a much larger force. In Iten-Lambai-Sichisif, after Montségur rest fall, Queribus became a refuge for Cathar, perfecti and fadits, who used it as a base to coordinate resistance and smuggle supplies. The castle's commander, Chabot de Barbera, a seasoned warrior, organized raids against Crusader outposts, disrupting their control and keeping the spark of rebellion alive. These efforts weren't about winning the war, they were about survival, buying time for the Cathars to preserve their texts, rituals, and beliefs. But the Inquisition was tightening its grip. By the 1250s, inquisitors like Bernard Gouy, a Dominican monk whose later writings became infamous, perfected their methods. They offered rewards for informants, turning neighbors against each other, and used torture to extract names of Cathar sympathizers. The Judas Cradle and other devices remained in use, often in secret dungeons where victims were broken physically and mentally to betray their allies. One chilling example comes from the town of Albi, where a woman named Beatrice de Planasols was interrogated in 1245. Under threat of torture, she revealed the names of dozens of Cathar supporters, leading to a wave of arrests. These betrayals, often coerced, fractured the resistance. As trust became a luxury few could afford, life for the Cathars became a constant game of evasion. Perfecti changed their appearances, shaving beards or wearing Catholic-style clothing to blend in. Believers held secret gatherings in barns or forests, whispering their prayers to avoid detection. A practical tip for understanding this: think of the Cathars like a resistance movement in a dystopian novel, forced to operate in the shadows, always one step ahead of a surveillance network that never sleeps. Their courage was remarkable, but the odds were stacked against them. The French crown, now deeply involved, poured resources into the region, building new fortresses and garrisoning troops to choke off the last strongholds. By the early 1250s, even Queribus fell, captured in 1255 after a brief siege. The remaining Cathars scattered further, some fleeing to northern Italy or Spain, where small communities of heretics still lingered. The Inquisition's records show a steady decline in arrests, not because the Cathars had disappeared entirely, but because they had become ghosts nearly invisible, practicing their faith in utter secrecy. This phase marked the slow, painful fading of open resistance, as the Cathars were hunted to the brink of extinction. The final flickers of Cathar defiance showed their incredible resilience, but the cost was immense. Families were torn apart, communities destroyed, and a once thriving culture reduced to whispers. Next, we'll explore how the Church and Crown consolidated their victory, reshaping Languedoc into a loyal Catholic region and erasing the last traces of Cathar influence. Chapter 9: Consolidating Power. The Church and Crown remake Languedoc with the fall of strongholds like Montségur and Queribus. The Albigensian Crusade and the Inquisition had all but crushed the Cathar resistance by the mid-1250s. Once a vibrant mosaic of independent lords, diverse beliefs, and cultural tolerance, was now a battle-scarred region under the tightening grip of the Catholic Church and the French Crown. This chapter explores how these two powers, spiritual and secular, worked together to reshape Languedoc, erasing Cathar influence, consolidating control, and transforming the region into a loyal, Orthodox Catholic stronghold. It's a story of political maneuvering, cultural erasure, and the rewriting of a region's identity, all while the last embers of Catharism flickered in secret. Let's step into Languedoc in the 1250s. The landscape is dotted with the ruins of burned villages, abandoned castles, and fields reclaimed by weeds. The Crusaders' victories left behind a power vacuum, as many local lords, either killed, exiled, or stripped of their lands, could no longer govern. The French crown, under King Louis IX, saw a golden opportunity to extend royal authority into this historically independent region. The Church, meanwhile, wanted to ensure no trace of heresy could ever resurface. Together, they launched a multi-pronged campaign that combined military occupation, religious enforcement, and economic restructuring to remake Languedoc in their image. The first step was securing the region militarily. After the fall of key Cathar strongholds, the French crown established a network of royal garrisons and built new fortresses to maintain control. For example, the city of Carcassonne, once a Cathar refuge, was transformed into a heavily fortified royal stronghold, its massive double walls and towers a symbol of French dominance. These fortifications weren't just defensive. They were a constant reminder to the local population that resistance was futile. Royal seneschals administrators appointed by the king took over governance, replacing local lords who had supported or tolerated the Cathars. These officials enforced French law, collected taxes, and ensured loyalty to the crown, effectively turning Languedoc into an extension of northern France. The Church, meanwhile, intensified the Inquisition's efforts to stamp out any remaining Cathar believers. By the 1250s, the Inquisition had become a well-oiled machine, led by figures like Bernard Gouy, whose Manual for Inquisitors, the Practica Inquisitionis, became a blueprint for rooting out heresy. Inquisitors didn't just hunt for active Catholics. They targeted anyone who might have sympathized with them in the past. Entire communities were summoned to swear oaths of Catholic orthodoxy, and those who hesitated were marked as suspects. A chilling example comes from the village of Montségur, where inquisitorial records later, studied by historian Emmanuel Leroy Ladurie, reveal how even minor acts, like refusing to eat meat, a Cathar practice, could lead to interrogation. Suspects faced grueling sessions, sometimes involving torture devices like the Judas Cradle, to extract confessions or names of others. The goal was to create a climate of fear where no one dared whisper a word of heresy. Economic control was another weapon in this campaign. The church and crown confiscated the lands and wealth of convicted heretics, redistributing them to loyal Catholics or Crusader allies. This wasn't just punishment, it was a deliberate strategy to dismantle the social structures that had supported Catharism. For instance, in Toulouse, once a hub of Cathar sympathy, the Count's family was forced to cede vast estates to the crown and church. These seizures enriched royal coffers and rewarded northern nobles who had joined the crusade, creating a new class of landowners loyal to Paris and Rome. A practical tip for understanding this: think of it like a medieval version of asset forfeiture, where entire communities lost their economic base to ensure compliance. Much like how modern regimes might seize property to weaken opposition, the Church also worked to erase Cathar culture by reshaping religious life. New cathedrals and monasteries sprang up across Languedoc, like the imposing Basilica of Saint-Nazaire in Carcassonne, built to project Catholic dominance. Dominican and Franciscan friars flooded the region, preaching against heresy and offering a vision of Christianity that emphasized obedience to Rome. They also established schools to indoctrinate the next generation, ensuring that children grew up with Catholic teachings rather than Cathar dualism. In some cases, former Cathar believers were forced to wear yellow crosses on their clothing, a public mark of shame that ostracized them and discouraged others from straying. This cultural overhaul was slow but relentless, aiming to wipe out the memory of Catharism itself. Despite these efforts, traces of Catharism lingered in secret. Some believers, hidden in remote villages or exiled in places like northern Italy, continued their rituals in hushed gatherings. Inquisitorial records from the 1260s mention small groups caught practicing the consolamentum, showing that the faith hadn't been entirely extinguished. But these were isolated acts of defiance, unable to challenge the new order. The French crown solidified its control with the Treaty of Paris in 1229, which had already forced Count Raymond VII of Toulouse to cede much of his power, and by the 1260s, Languedoc was fully integrated into the French kingdom. The region's unique culture, its tolerance, its Occitan language, its independence was gradually smothered under the weight of royal and ecclesiastical authority. This consolidation wasn't just a victory for the church and crown. It was a profound transformation of a region's identity. Languedoc, once a beacon of diversity, became a cautionary tale of what happens when centralized power crushes dissent. A practical tip for grasping the scale: imagine a modern region with a distinct cultural identity like Catalonia or Quebec being absorbed into a larger nation, its traditions outlawed, its leaders replaced, and its history rewritten. That's what Languedoc endured. On a bloodier scale, the remaking of Languedoc marked the effective end of the Cathar movement, but its legacy would linger in unexpected ways. Next, we'll Chapter 10. The legacy of the Albigensian Crusade. The Albigensian Crusade, spanning from 1209 to 1229 and followed by decades of inquisitorial purges, left Languedoc a shadow of its former self. The Cathars were all but eradicated, their strongholds reduced to ruins, and their once vibrant culture suppressed under the weight of French royal and Catholic dominance. Yet, the Crusades' impact stretched far beyond the borders of southern France, leaving a lasting mark on European history, religion, and the relationship between church and state. This final chapter explores the long-term consequences of the Crusade, the faint echoes of Catharism that lingered, and the lessons we can draw from this brutal chapter of the past. Let's start with Languedoc itself. By the 1270s, the region was firmly under French control, its independent spirit crushed. The integration of Languedoc into the French kingdom, solidified by the Treaty of Paris in 1229 and reinforced by royal governance, marked a turning point. In the centralization of France, King Louis IX and his successors used the Crusades' momentum to expand royal authority, turning a patchwork of semi-autonomous regions into a more unified state. Cities like Toulouse and Carcassonne, once centers of resistance, became administrative hubs for the crown, their economies redirected to serve Paris. The Occitan language and culture, which had flourished in Languedoc's courts and troubadour traditions, began to fade, overshadowed by the French language and northern customs. A practical tip for understanding this: think of Languedoc's transformation as a medieval version of cultural assimilation, where a distinct regional identity is absorbed into a larger, homogenized nation, much like the erosion of indigenous cultures under colonial rule. The Catholic Church also emerged stronger, but changed. The Albigensian Crusade and the Inquisition that followed set a precedent for how the Church dealt with dissent. The formalized Inquisition, with its meticulous records, tribunals, and use of torture like the Judas Cradle, became a model for later campaigns against heretics, witches, and other perceived threats across Europe. The Church's willingness to partner with secular powers, like the French crown, blurred the lines between spiritual and temporal authority, giving rise to a more authoritarian model of Christianity. For example, the methods honed in Languedoc were later used in the Spanish Inquisition, which targeted Jews, Muslims, and Protestants with similar ruthlessness. The Crusade also entrenched the Dominicans as the Church's enforcers, their black and white robes becoming a symbol of fear across medieval Europe. But what about the Cathars themselves? By the late 13th century, their open communities were gone, their leaders burned or exiled. Yet, faint traces of their beliefs persisted. In remote corners of Languedoc, a few believers continued secret rituals into the early 1300s, as seen in the inquisitorial records from Montségur, where villagers like Pierre Maury clung to Cathar teachings in hushed gatherings. Some Cathars fled to northern Italy, particularly Lombardy, where small dualist communities survived for a time under less intense scrutiny. These remnants were too scattered to pose a threat, but their persistence speaks to the resilience of their faith. Legends also grew around the Cathars, particularly the idea of a hidden treasure, smuggled out of Montségur before its fall, possibly sacred texts or relics that fueled later. Myths about secret societies and holy grails. The Crusades' legacy also reshaped European attitudes toward religious tolerance. Before 1209, Languedoc was a rare haven of coexistence, where Catholics, Cathars, Jews, and others lived side by side. The Crusades' violence and the Inquisition's paranoia destroyed this, replacing it with a model of conformity enforced by fear. This shift had ripple effects, contributing to centuries of religious conflicts, from the Reformation to the 30 Years' War. A practical tip for grasping this impact: imagine a modern society where diverse beliefs are tolerated, then suddenly outlawed, with neighbors spying on each other and dissenters punished. That's the chilling precedent set in Languedoc, one that echoed through history. On a broader scale, the Crusade highlighted the dangers of blending religious zeal with political ambition. The promise of land, wealth, and papal indulgences drew northern nobles to the crusade, while the Church used the campaign to tighten its grip on Christendom. This fusion of faith and power set a template for later holy wars, including the Crusades to the Holy Land and colonial conquests justified by religion. It also raised questions about justice and morality that resonate today. The use of torture, like the Judas Cradle, to extract confessions or enforce conformity wasn't just a medieval horror, it's a reminder of how fear can be weaponized to silence dissent. A tactic seen in modern authoritarian regimes. The Albigensian Crusade, then, was more than a war against a small sect. It was a turning point that reshaped a region, a religion, and a continent. Languedoc's scars are still visible in its ancient castles and quiet villages, where stories of the Cathar linger as a testament to both human courage and cruelty. As we reflect on this history, it challenges us to consider the cost of intolerance and the value of standing up for belief in the face of overwhelming odds. Thanks for joining me on this